Hey, I'm Follygon, and in this video I will be sculpting my Oni Girl Original Character. Creating your own characters is not easy, or at least it isn't for me. I'm someone that has made an entire career out of translating other artists' work from 2D to 3D. But recently I've started getting a lot more interested in creating my own art. Over the past couple years, I've started small personal projects creating original characters. These are projects I would typically work on for only a single day, maybe sculpting for a total of 3 hours at most. Which, if you don't know, is barely any time for a full 3D character. This character that I'm working on right now took roughly 10 to 11 hours. I've also gotten really into 2D art lately, and have started a second YouTube channel where I'm learning to draw, called Drawly. You see, I've spent so long making art for clients in the past that I never really had the time for exploring my own creations. Well, I'm doing that now with this character. I wanted to keep the prompt simple, so I just started with the words Oni Girl. I know, very simple. Either way, first I gathered references of what others have done for examples of successful ideas, and then I immediately get started sculpting in ZBrush. I am not the type of person that can just immediately have this perfect idea in my head right away. Inspiration finds me, or rather I find it while working. This gives me a chance to not only find what does work, but also what doesn't. And that's what I started doing with this character. But that direction that I started with was a necessary step to lead me to where this character ended up. That's part of the design process. Rarely do I see anyone get something perfect right away on their first go. And social media is a great platform for a disingenuous representation of exactly that. You can scroll past countless amazing artworks in minutes without even thinking twice about the hard work, passion, and most importantly, the mistakes that went into making that finished thing that you looked at, clicked like on, and scrolled past all in a matter of mere seconds. Slowly, subconsciously, eroding the respect for the sheer amount of time good art takes to create. So that when we finally sit down to make something, we expect faster results than what we're getting, and we don't necessarily even know why. And it's something that I work hard to show in these videos, because I want people to understand that it is difficult. So normally when I'm creating a character, I get most of my inspiration from working on the face. But with this character, I actually got that from working on the body. So in terms of designing this character, figuring out the shape language that I'm going to use, kind of getting rid of those preconceived ideas that I went in with that I thought would work absolutely 100% perfectly, and discovering, out of that what small percentage did work and out of it what did not work, which is often a lot. Typically when you go in with this idea, you find out what does work and what doesn't work pretty quick, as long as you are willing to kind of cut ideas as soon as they don't work. I try not to get too attached to what I'm creating, and that is honestly just something that kind of comes with practice of not getting attached to what you are creating. It is for the sake of improvement that we must sometimes take one step backward to take 2 steps forward. So with this body, with this character's face, it's all really rough. It's all really nasty. It looks ridiculous, right? But that's the point of a sketch. It's something that a lot of people I feel like don't enjoy showing off, but I actually love to see sketches. Sculptural sketches, the early stages, because that shows the thought process of the person that is creating the artwork. You kind of get to take a step behind the curtain and see a little bit of what they were kind of thinking about while they were working, and during those early stages specifically. And that's why I really enjoy getting to show off this part of the process as often as possible. I actually get a lot of comments, even on my most recent video, that are like, hey, this looks absolutely horrible. Like a lot of comments with timestamps that say things like, oh, this is my nightmare from last night, or stuff like that, which I don't care about. It really, I think it's funny too, because I'm sculpting it. I know what it looks like. I know how it looks bad in the beginning and during those early stages, and I don't care. It doesn't really matter what it looks like right now. It matters what it looks like when you set your pen down and say, I am finished. So you have to be comfortable with those early stages. And for me, what that looks like is just trying to keep things rough and move fast. Right now, I am moving into refining on the face, but I absolutely hate the face right now. It's not what the character, it's not what I wanted the character to feel like. It's not what I wanted the character to look like. It's, very different than what I kind of wanted to go toward in terms of shape language, in terms of overall direction. So I start playing with something else. I always recommend that if you are struggling on one area, or even if you're just spending too long in one area, jump around as much as you can. So that's what I'm doing. I'm jumping around to the character's body, and I'm beginning to experiment and see what I can do here. So at this point, I'm actually not even using any reference whatsoever. I am just completely experimenting with shape language. And this is not genuinely something that I recommend doing unless you have a big visual library, or if you have, just in general, what that means is a lot of experience. So what I am trying to do is create shapes that have visual interests that work well together based on a lot of the stuff that I've done in the past. So I love playing around with really sharp shapes. I love exaggerating forms, and I love creating what I call kind of sharp soft shapes. It's kind of a weird term, right? Those are kind of at opposition with each other, sharp soft. But the idea there is that I'm creating exaggerated plane changes that I can use later and soften and turn into more organic forms. This is a really powerful strategy for figuring out where forms are turning, but I love to also use it for exaggerating ideas. So that's what I do during the early part of working on this character. I exaggerate, I see what kind of starts working, what I enjoy, and then I'll often take a little bit of a break. And then I'll come back with some fresh eyes, some fresh perspective, and that really helps me to get in the right headspace, not overly noodle, which if you're not familiar with is this idea that you're kind of working on your artwork, but you're not really making any changes. And that's a very common place to be. So now I'm going into the process of what is called refinement. Refinement is when you take what you already have, you keep and exaggerate or exemplify the good, and you remove the bad or try to improve upon that as much as you possibly can. And that really does require either some outside perspective if you don't have a lot of experience, or some fresh perspective in way of yourself, which I mentioned you can kind of get from taking a break, stepping back for a little bit. There are many ways, that you can get perspective or fresh perspective. In a lot of 2D art, you'll see people flip their canvas a lot. That's a really popular strategy. Also one that I employ in my 2D art. So there's a lot of ways to get some new fresh perspective. So I am just working on the body and trying to create some visual interest, as I've already said. Really what this kind of looks like is just trying stuff. In the most simple way that I could explain it, I am just trying things. I never like to do the same thing the exact same way twice. So with the character's stylized anatomical form, I know that I want this to be a softer, rounder, more feminine character, and because of that, I am going to create a lot of these exaggerated, hard, nasty, rough forms in the beginning part of the process, but I know that later on, I'm going to have to edit and reduce almost all of that, and only keep some of the little bits of what works. So a great example is the back of the character right now. The back of the character is a complete mess. It's just got a lot of these sketchy lines. So does the front, but the back's crazy messy right now. And it is going to require me to go back in there and be a good editor. And that is just something that kind of takes experience. You have to, as I mentioned earlier, not be too attached to your work. You have to be able to remove what doesn't work, keep what does, and try to find a nice balance. It's a very difficult thing to do, even for me. And at this stage, after kind of playing with my forms, I really get to a stage that I enjoy what I have. I really enjoy the forms that I'm creating for the body. I really like a lot of the stuff that I've exaggerated on. However, taking a larger step back and looking at everything as a whole, compared to the head and the general direction that I want to go in, I find that the proportions feel extremely boring. You know, if we just look at the surface, you know, if we just break it down and look at, oh, look at this shape in the lower leg, that feels really visually interesting to me, very visually distinct. However, as a whole, it really kind of just falls apart. It doesn't really meet the criteria that I'm aiming for. So that is something that I go back and make some big changes to. Larger, big changes are something that I am a huge proponent of. The earlier you can make those, the better. But if you have a workflow similar to me, where you're working with a subdivision reprojection workflow, you can easily go back in and make those changes later just by stepping down to your lowest subdiv and using masking, transpose master, whatever you feel most comfortable with. So that is something that I do to the body later to push on proportions. And I decide that I've, at this stage kind of worked on the body enough, so I need to go back up to the face and continue working on that and try to take that absolutely atrocious face and try to make it into something more visually interesting, more visually appealing. So like I said, I found that inspiration though, while actually working on the body, which doesn't normally happen for me. Normally I find that while working on the face, as that is the most interesting part of characters for me. But for some reason, I really enjoyed a lot of the cool shapes that I was creating with this body. I really liked some of the exaggeration that I was getting in there, and I'm really happy with the overall fun proportions that I get with this character toward the end. I really like the overall just aesthetic of the character, ending up with these kind of plump, rounded forms for areas like the character's horns. The arms have some really interesting proportions, so do the legs, the torso, etc. There's just some really cool stuff that I end up liking about this character. I think that, there's still always room for improvement, but the point of me working on and trying to improve character design is that I need to really kind of improve my quantity. I know that I can create really high quality characters, but that actual skill that exists separately from just making a character, that ability to design something visually unique, visually interesting, that is something that I'm always trying to work on and practice. And for that, I feel like I personally need some more quantity. But with this one, I definitely really enjoyed it. It's up to you whether or not you think I stuck the landing there at the end. Maybe you guys can let me know down in the comments. But I really enjoyed this one. Some more just general work here on the face as I push more into that shape language that I'm looking for. You can see everything is feeling much more kind of round, much more plump. And I'm also trying to find some balance between those shapes. So just like in writing, if everything is bold or everything's in all caps, then nothing's bold, right? Nothing's in caps. So with art, or with sculpture specifically, if everything is round and soft, well, then nothing is round and soft. Or it just feels really boring. Everything's still round and soft, but it doesn't have the impact that it could have otherwise. So that is why you need to have some balance. You need to create shapes that have some harder edges or some harder transitions in a few places. If you don't do that, everything is going to feel exactly the same, and that's just really, really boring. So what I try to do is I try to balance some of these rounder, softer shapes with some harder edges. Some of those areas include the mouth, the nose, the ears with these kind of triangular shapes, and some of those harder edges that I have on the horns as well, specifically separating the top and bottom section. The transition started a little hard, but that was just a little too strong for me personally, so I had to go back in and be a good editor and try to reduce some of that sharpness. Moving on to hair. Hair is always something that is a ton of fun to work on. I actually find it even therapeutic sometimes. If you guys are interested in learning more about sculpting hair, I actually just released a new tutorial on my Patreon, which you can check out at the link down below in the description. In that tutorial, I create 3 different hairstyles, and one of those hairstyles that I teach you how to make is the hairstyle that is on this character. So I do a short hairstyle, medium, and a long hairstyle, talking about all sorts of awesome ideas like flow, how you can split things up into parts, and just create really clean, basic primary forms. So again, if you're interested in that, check it out at the link below. There's a ton of other great content on my Patreon as well. A lot of other tutorials included, all for the same price. So hey, lots of bonuses. Back to the body and back to refinement. So at this stage, I, for the most part, pretty much like everything that I have in the body, but I just need to kind of clean up what I've already created. The proportions are still pretty boring, but that's something that I come back in and fix. At this point, the transition from the torso into the legs, that general hip region, was feeling pretty awkward, so I wanted to make a lot of changes there. I also wanted to make changes to the upper torso, specifically the back, as I had mentioned earlier, was very messy and required a lot of cleanup to get that into a nice place. Of course, the chest, just working on the rib cage and the breast area, trying to make those feel a lot more organic, as previously I had just sculpted in some really hard edges, and that always feels really awkward when you have some rounded forms that you're expecting to be represented and some really sharp plane changes. Same thing's going on with the stomach, where I need to go back and soften a lot of those forms. I'll do the same thing on the rib cage, blending down into the stomach, just getting all these forms to kind of generally work better together. But I also have to be careful here. I don't want to get rid of every single hard edge that I've created, because again, we end up going too far in the opposite direction, where we have now all soft edges, and that doesn't feel right either. So I have to kind of balance what I'm going to keep, what I'm going to remove, and not necessarily remove, that's probably a bad way to word that, more so just edit slightly. So I'll take a hard edge and I'll use something like a trim brush or some smooth brushes to adjust those and make them a little softer, maybe bevel the edges, trying to nudge it gently in the direction of feeling more organic. And slowly but surely, all those changes, as you can see, are starting to add up to something that feels a lot more organic than what we had just a few moments ago. Back up to the character's face for some more refinement. I mentioned that, with the body, I have to go back over everything that I've already done up to this point and do another pass on it, just work on and improve. And now I'm just doing that exact same idea here on the face, trying to add some more detail, little things like nostrils, while also improving the overall shape language that I've created for the character's nose. Doing the same thing to the lips. They were feeling a little flat, the eyes were feeling a little flat as well, so I need to go back into all of these areas and adjust them slightly to push them into a more refined level. Especially because the face is a huge focal point, you definitely want to spend as much time as you possibly can up there. But I don't want to take it too far because, this is, with this style, it's relatively simple, it's relatively clean, and I don't want to go in here and start adding things like skin pores, as that is going to kind of completely remove the purpose of something like this style. So just trying to find balance in all things here and try to push and improve upon what I already have. If you've watched any of my videos before, you will hear me talk about exaggeration quite a lot, and that is something that I love to do with paint as well, not just form, but especially when I'm painting my character's face, I will often put on some very, very strong or high contrast areas of paint. So really saturated reds, even though she's like this light pink color, I'll put these really saturated reds around the cheeks, maybe these super dark purples around the eyelids, indicating maybe a shadow, maybe a little bit of some makeup, maybe a combination of the two. As well as maybe, darkening some slight areas, painting in some shadows, but for the most part I tend to keep that pretty light. Either way, at the end of the day, I like to exaggerate that stuff and then nudge it back. And the way I do that is just by filling back in my base color over top of all that paint that I just made, until I find a nice, pleasant balance between those changes. It's kind of like painting a layer and then turning down the opacity on that layer. For the hair, I noodle around with some different styles for a while before I land on something akin to a short bob cut, which I kind of take a little bit further, clean up, and really adjust my geometry. When I started with this hairstyle, it was just a sphere that I stretched out and cut and hollowed out. And then from there, I ended up going back over top of it and recreating some of the pieces of geometry so that I could have something more clean. My initial sculpting that I did on this helped me find the style that I wanted to create, but the process that I went through it with was just a little too messy for the end result that I wanted. The character that I'm creating and the style that I'm aiming for is definitely much more clean than what I had there on the hair initially. So after going back in and remeshing a lot of that geometry, which is a pretty simple process, just a little tedious, so I won't cover it here. But after doing that, it's very easy for me now with the current hairstyle, the current direction decided, to go back in and start making some adjustments to that. So I was really enjoying this hairstyle at this point. All I needed to do was make sure that I kind of stuck the landing, brought it into a cohesive level, really worked on getting the overall volume in a nice spot, and making sure all of those pieces of hair were blending together well. And now, finally, some changes to the proportions of the character to really just help exaggerate this style a lot more. The proportions I had before I made these changes still felt too human. It felt too standard to what we might expect. So I really played with shrinking that torso down and exaggerating the limbs of the character to really give it that cartoony feel. So I really pumped up the volume of the forearms, as you can see. I really pumped up the volume of the calves or lower leg there, and I shrunk down everything from neck to crotch and really just pushed on that general feel. And I love the proportions that I've pushed into now. And after, of course, ever doing Transpose Master, I recommend you go back in afterwards and clean up some of your changes. Actually, my next tutorial that I'm creating on my Patreon is going to be about that topic, as well as about posing, which I'll be talking about more here very soon. So I absolutely love the changes that I've made to the character. Now I'm just going back in. Now that I've really landed on a solid direction that I'm happy with, I just wanted to go back in and clean up a little more, try to get that shape language just that tiny bit more solid. There were still a few areas where things felt a little too hard, and a couple areas here and there where things were looking a little messy. So I just needed to go back in, clean that up, and really put that into a polished state. Here I am playing around with colors for my character. This is not something I normally do, but I ended up finding this tool called Coolers. Coolers? I don't really know how you say it. Either way, this is a fantastic tool for finding some different color palettes. I used it specifically based on the color that I had for the body. I mentioned in other videos that typically I'll just create some colors early on and I'll stick with those, but now I'm trying to be a little more self-aware to make sure that I don't just pick some colors that don't work super well together, so I'm trying to edit myself or critique myself in that way a little more. So I'm trying to get better at color, and I'm trying to use some tools that can maybe help lead me in a little bit of a better direction with that, helping me find some grays or some darker colors that can help tie a design together a little more. And then, after that, I can go in and start working on some costuming. Typically, with outfits, I try about a million things before I decide on a direction. This time, I ended up finding a couple different outfits online that I just kind of picked and chose from. I, at this point, was kind of wanting her to go in the direction of maybe like a princess type character or someone that is a royalty. So that was kind of the direction that I leaned into with this outfit, which I know it doesn't look like now, but give it some time and I promise it will shape up a little more into that. And this is often something that I'll struggle with, because with this character, I created this really interesting proportion and form for the character's body, but now I'm covering a lot of that up. I really liked a lot of the forms that I had in the arms and in the back, and you can't really see a ton of that. So I end up doing two different versions of the character, one with this almost kimono-like clothing on top and one without, so that you can see the body and see all those cool forms that I sculpted, because hey, I took the time to make those and I want to be able to show them off, right? I learned about a little design hack recently that you can do with characters, which is giving them some kind of little silhouette form for the top of their head to help them be more recognizable, more distinct. This is a hack that I found actually extremely useful in this character, and although the character has horns, which you could argue is that already, I wanted to give her this little almost floating spirit crown something that would help set her apart visually. So if you just see the character in terms of a silhouette, you would immediately have this recognizable form above the head that you would say, oh, that's blah, blah, blah. Speaking of, I am very bad at coming up with names for my characters. So if you have a suggestion, I would love to hear it. Please put it down in the comments section below. So that little form on top of the head, I think, adds a nice visual, distinct identifier for the character, whatever her name might be. And then from here, I need to go through and do the same process that I've pretty much done on my body and my face, but now do this for my character's clothing. So I am still at this point kind of deciding on some of the direction that I want to go in, but for the most part, I have, all of the key elements in there, let's call them. So I just need to go in and refine things like this little form for the bow for the back of the kimono, kind of working on that strap around the waist. I had these little ropes, if you saw those very briefly, around the belt in the middle, but I ended up removing those entirely because I felt like it was too small of a detail, driving too much of the viewer's attention potentially to the area of the stomach, which is not where I want your attention. I want your attention on the character's face and maybe a couple other areas here that you'll see once we kind of get more into posing and creating the last accessory. So with the pose, I wanted to go with something relatively simple. I'm trying to get some nice contrapposto forms here, which is essentially counterpose, or in essence, counterbalance, you can think of it as. This is the idea, if you've ever seen something like the Statue of David, it's a relatively simple idea, that you offset the weight or balance of the shoulders and the hips. You can drive that a little further in a couple other ideas and really exaggerate that from many different angles to make that as good as possible, but that is essentially the basic idea. So I am using a tool called Transpose Master to pose my character here. There are many things that I had to do though before I got to this part to make this process a whole lot easier. There are a lot of things that can go wrong in Transpose Master, and it is a very kind of finicky tool to work with, which is why my tutorial for next month over on my Patreon is going to be on this tool and on posing characters in general. So after I do the initial pose, what I like to do is go back in, just like I would with a character blockout, and start to refine. I find that if you try to do really nice, clean transformations in the beginning and try to get everything perfect, say in a leg, well, let's say you spend an hour doing that, and then you come back, a little bit later and you're like, oh, wait, I want to change this big thing on my pose. And all that work that you just did on making that arm or leg or whatever work absolutely perfect with that pose before, now doesn't really serve any purpose. You're gonna have to go back in and make all of those changes. So I try to make really big, general, sweeping changes early on, and then later on, go back in, fix, refine anything that's broken, and try to have that all work in a really cohesive way. So I try not to worry if things like my clothing is clipping a little bit. If it's clipping a lot, I might go in and make some changes, but for the most part, I just leave it and then come back to it later. Because there are a lot of things that can go wrong when you are posing a high resolution model. But if you do the correct work to prepare it, to enter in this stage in a nice convenient way with subdivs and some other things, you can make this process just a whole lot more easy to do. Additionally, when you pose a character, depending on how the limbs and different areas of the body are deforming, say your character's butt, there might be forms that shift and change. If you're putting a lot of weight on a leg and you have one leg completely straight versus one leg kind of shifted forward, there are going to be different areas of compression, different areas of volume. So for example, when you bend your arm, your bicep is going to flex and pull up, and that's going to make some changes there. Depending on the angle that you twist your forearm, pronation and supination, that's going to cause some differences there as well. These exist all throughout the body and can cause a whole lot of differences, which is why I recommend, again, making those big changes before you go in and try to fix every little thing. After doing all of that work, just like the early stages of sculpting, I'll go back in and try a refinement pass yet again, just seeing how I can push it even further. So I mentioned that idea of contrapposto earlier, counterpoise, trying to exaggerate some of that here, turn some of the weight of the head, of the neck, kind of exaggerating a little bit of that form there, really offsetting the shoulders, the hips, and the head in general, and really just trying to make sure that this pose works well from every angle and makes sense. It's really easy to make a character look great from one angle, but when you all of a sudden rotate it around, the pose or the forms in general can feel completely off. So I do a lot of work to make sure that my balance for my character from every possible angle is feeling nice. And this is just something that you have to accept as a digital sculptor or a 3D artist. It is not like 2D art where you are working on it only from a single angle. You have to, of course, work on it from every possible angle and make it as good as you can. Toward the end of the process comes little things like adding fingernails and refining bits of clothing, trying to clean things up, trying to exaggerate some of the forms that I had earlier that might be a little broken. Areas like the arms, as I mentioned earlier, bending and flexing that arm up has caused a few areas to warp or change a little bit. Twisting and tilting the body causes this as well. So it's all about just going back in and having that attention to detail to make sure that you don't leave any stones unturned. Now I am creating the final asset for the character, which is going to be a scroll. I wanted to create kind of like a royal scroll that I could write something a little cheeky on, as you will see here very soon. This was really fun to create. I actually referenced some clip art for how the form kind of bounces off of the ground. And was created very simply just by extruding a plane, as you can see here. And I used a couple different tools. There are some kind of cheat ways you can throw in some edge loops, but for the most part, I just use what is called the Z-Modeler brush. The Z-Modeler brush is the poly modeling tool in ZBrush. And it's a little complicated to use. It takes a little time to get used to. It's really not that bad after you get used to it. I have a tutorial for it over on my Patreon as well as my course, The Appeal Academy, if you're interested in learning more. But either way, while working on this, it did crash, the software that is, and I had to redo it, but thankfully it wasn't too much work. I think my quick saves are set up to the default, which is every 15 or 20 minutes. So it's really hard to lose a lot of work when you have something like quick save, which is an automatic saving tool in ZBrush in case of crashes, of course, which do still happen, but not as often as they used to. When I started sculpting, I mean, like literally every hour, every 2 hours, I think ZBrush would crash. So it's a lot better now, although there are a few operations that I am aware of that can cause crashes with the Z-Modeler tool, and specifically symmetry. Edge operations can get a little confusing for it sometime. So I try to quick save as often as possible while I am using the Z-Modeler brush. So if you are using the Z-Modeler brush and or interested in that, or working on low poly pieces with symmetry, might be something you want to keep in mind for the future. Just hit that quick save button in the top right hand corner. At the end here, it's just time to add in details, little things that need correcting or need to be done that I've put off up until this point. So I go ahead and readjust all of the fingernails for the character, making sure that those are fit and put into place. I also go back over top of the hands for the character and work on those a lot more to clean them up and make sure that things are feeling natural. So I adjust the pose. I also adjust some of the transitions for the joints. I also keep the hands relatively simple. They're not a huge focal point for the character. I want most of that attention to be up on the face, but of course, we still gotta make them look nice, so I spend a little time doing that here at the end. And then I finish up by making sure that all of those pieces are interacting together in a believable way. I create the text for the royal scroll, and I send everything over to Blender to begin rendering the character. And before I show off those final juicy renders for you, here are a couple quick turntables of the character, showing off the character in a neutral pose with the 2 possible outfit options that I had for her, as well as a posed turntable, again with both options. I really couldn't decide what I wanted to do because I really liked the forms in the arms. I thought they were really cool and I wanted to show them off, but I also really liked the clothing that I created and I thought it went well with the character. So hey, I did both. Well, hey, I really hope that you enjoyed getting to see the process of me working on and creating an original character, my thought process and everything that goes on behind the scenes into me creating this finished piece. Hope that you enjoyed it all. If you did, click that like button, and if you're new around here, click subscribe. If you would like to learn more about digital sculpting, check out the links down below for my Patreon and my online course, The Appeal Academy, where I teach you absolutely everything I know about creating appealing characters. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.